So I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening for our webinar. We really appreciate your participation. Um, Thank you for to all of our Brilliant Minds collective members. And thank you for anyone who isn't a member but is interested in becoming a member. Thank you so much for joining. We will have two admins in the chat this evening, Judith Skinner and Deirdre Gary. So if you have any questions, we ask that you please direct them into the chat, and just know that the administrators will grab those questions from you and direct them to our moderator, Richard Gray. So feel free to chat away with anyone that you have, if you have any questions or you have any comments, please feel free to put them into the chat, but please do not unmute yourselves because it would interfere with the webinar. So with that being said, the title of this webinar is Generation Who? Tools to Connect and Address the Challenges Facing Today's Black Teens and Young Adults. This three-part series presents a deep dive into the African American teen and young adult community, exploring how history and personal narratives have affected and continue to affect the following focus areas: education, business, and mental health. Our experts will focus on identifying the tools we can use to solve these critical issues. Tonight is part one of this webinar series, and it is entitled Social Justice in Education. This webinar this evening will explore how we can better empower students, parents, and teachers to create an optimum educational opportunity for Black students. Our panelists are experts who have dedicated their careers to reform disparities in schools and promoting social justice across the country. Black students want to succeed. Education achievement is one of the greatest indicators of financial success in our society. The importance of education in STEM, coding, critical thinking, and innovation grows as we move towards a more service-based technical economy. Public schools have generally failed to provide many Black youth the education they require to be successful. So we appreciate that each one of our panelists and our moderator come together this evening to discuss this topic. I want to introduce our wonderful moderator this evening. Give us one moment. Richard, thank you so much for joining. Richard Gray is the director of the Center for Community Organizing and Engagement at NYU Steinhardt. Richard's work includes providing support and strategic assistance to community and youth organizing public education campaigns and programs, helping to build alliances between CBOs, unions, and research policy institutes. Before joining the Metro Center, Mr. Gray directed the community organizing and engagement at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University and Annenberg Center for Education Organizing at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform. He was also the co-executive director of the National Coalition of Advocates for Students, a nationwide network of child advocacy organizations that work to improve the access of quality public education to student populations who have traditionally been underserved by public schools. A lecturer of law at Columbia Law School, Mr. Gray received a BA in history from Brown University and his JD from Boal Hall School of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. So I want to welcome you, Richard Gray. Thank you so much for moderating this evening, and I am going to turn everything over to you.
I have the standard Zoom moment where you say something brilliant, but you're muted. And so I had to turn my camera. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. We have lived our practically a year of our lives on Zoom. And so the fact that you have chosen voluntarily to participate in another Zoom engagement does not go unnoticed and unappreciated. So we really appreciate you being here. And I appreciate having the opportunity to moderate this great panel of folks. And this is going to be more of a conversation that will start, and then we'll open it up to the audience for engagement, and then we'll conclude. But an opportunity to go into the issues that were just described. In this particular time, there are lessons that we are learning about what we need to do for, particularly for Black youth. But all of us have experienced something in our lifetime is a lesson for us to learn. And the question for us is how we create intergenerational strategies for problems that have taken generations to come about. And so this is an excellent opportunity to pick the brains of some great people here who I'll introduce on not only what should we be doing to support Black youth, but what kind of relationship do we need to be developing with young people that allows for them to learn from us, from our experience, but also for us to learn from them about how we apply our knowledge and experience in this particular moment in time. I have a 20-year-old son, and I tell him every time, I've been 20 before, but I've never been 20 right now. And so in order for me to be able to know how to share experiences with you, you've got to teach me what it means to be a young Black man right now. And then my role is to be able to take the experiences that I've learned and exchange them to you, not to tell you what to do, but to give you a frame that you then adapt to your learning. And we need to be developing those kinds of relationships with young people. And this is an opportunity for us to explore that. And so I'm going to start off by introducing the panelists. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the panelists and their titles, but I want to give each person an opportunity to give an introduction to themselves, say a little bit about their work. I think I caught Ro off guard. She's like, oh, Charles going to have to do that. It just could be brief introduction so that your voice gets into the space and you get an opportunity. So I'll start with you, Ro, if you don't mind. We're going to start with Ro Johnson, who's the supervising producer at Brick Art Music.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brick Arts Media. So, yeah.
So say a little bit about just introduce yourself.
Sure. Brick is a multidisciplinary arts and media institution. I am a supervising producer there with the Brick TV division, and for a period of time, a while, my concentration or my beat was education. So I covered a lot of education topics. A lot of them were inspired by my own involvement in the New York City public school system. I have a 20-year-old son, and as a parent, my husband and I have survived that system, and it's a topic that kind of, you don't get through that without having some pointers on how to navigate it. So I'm happy to be here and speak about this topic.
Thank you. And what you'll get a sense, and I appreciate it, Rose, people are not only going to share their work experience, but we each also have personal experiences, connections that inform the work that we do. And so I'm going to move on to Jerry L. Green, who's the CEO for the Black Student Advocate. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Brother Jerry.
Yeah, so Black Student Advocate started, I was publishing a Black business directory. So right around April 2017, started getting calls from parents asking, Jerry, who do you know that can go to school and help me? They're trying to kick my baby out of school. So I was able to flex my schedule and went to with the parents, and just me sitting in the meetings asking questions. It changed the whole dynamics of the meeting. So I said, hey, I can no longer go as the Southern California Black Business Expo. I need to change the name. So I started doing research, and Noah was in the Black Student Advocate lane. So I said, okay, I'll be the Black Student Advocate. So the first 2.5 years, I just poured into the community and was just supporting their efforts. And now we're almost 2,500 consultations later. So we advocate and stand the gap for both Black employees and Black students navigating through the school districts, dealing with mainly discipline, racism, bullying, targeting, and things like that. And a lot of people are really surprised to find that 1/3 of our calls are really bullying from staff.
So we're going to go into that more because this notion of advocacy and the role and is really, I think, a critical element to what we need to be discussing. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to Sharon Darris. And Sharon is the Executive Director of Columbia Business School Individual Giving. Sharon, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you. So first and foremost, I'm a Harlem native. Glad to claim that. So I'm actually new to Columbia, although I am a Columbia alum. But prior to about 4 weeks ago, I was the Executive Director of the Adams Street Foundation. And so the Adams Street Foundation is a 14-year-old nonprofit organization in Brooklyn that works with about 500 kids a year who are in high school, college focused. And so the organization does everything from SAT prep to pre-pandemic college tours, feedback on financial aid, serving mostly kids of color, mostly kids coming from underserved communities, and just trying to provide all the resources that you could imagine a young person needs to get into college. And many of the young people who we work with will be first generation going to college. About 60% of them or so typically go to a 4-year institution. About 30% will do a 2-year associate's degree, and 10% will do something else, work, military, Job Corps, etc. And so I had been with that organization for about 3.5 years, just recently left in the process of bringing on a new executive director. But that's my orientation. That's the work that I do. And I've done similar work like that for several years.
That's terrific. And we've got an interesting theme. Thank you so much of the narratives that are generating advocacy and the supports that are necessary for people, for students, that thinking about sort of the full range of supports. I do a lot of work
way too long
with community schools. I think want to ask people who are in the audience to mute themselves. I mean, we both know that voice. It's a brother that I know, so he kindly did that. He's gonna hear about that when we talk later this week. But you also talked about the services. Community schools has talked a lot about that education isn't just about academics, but we need to be thinking about all the kinds of supports that young people need. So I appreciate you bringing that in. And then last but not least is Howard Bell. Howard Bell is the CEO of ABLE, which is a company that does work around looking at technology in connection with education. But I want to have Howard talk to us a little bit about who he is and what he brings to the table.
So good to see everybody this evening. My name is Howard Bell. I am originally from Atlantic City, New Jersey. The story I always like to tell when I'm introducing myself is I'm the youngest of 6 kids. My mother was a high school dropout who decided to go back to school after having her youngest child, who was me. She ultimately had to go to community college because she decided that she wanted to be a nurse. But in order to do that, she had no childcare. We were very poor, so she actually took me with her to all of her community college classes. We celebrated a joint graduation, me from high school and her from community college with her associate's degree in the same year. It was a great lesson in what it means to watch a person recover from, an early stumble, but be able to take education by the horns and use it to transform her life, but even more significantly, to transform my own. Mm-hmm. I am the CEO of ABLE. ABLE is a venture capital-backed firm based in San Francisco. I joined right before the pandemic really hit as a CEO. So believe it or not, I have managed this team virtually since my coming on board. ABLE is an organization that focuses on this thing called the master scheduler. And we can talk about it in a little more detail later on, but it's basically the tool that impacts all of your kids from middle school through high school when it comes to talking about what classes they're going to be assigned to, what teachers they're going to get, and what resources they will get access to during those years just before they're about to go into post-secondary education. We focus specifically on equity, helping schools examine the decisions that get made in terms of this master scheduling process, showing how they're leaving kids behind every year, both in terms of the fact that they're graduating without the requisite supports, without the requisite knowledge, without the requisite rigor. And so Our job is not just to expose these deficiencies, but also to help them create plans and what we call operationalizing equity to ensure that they're able to have a systematic approach to ensuring that these inequities don't make it into their system ever again. And so that's the role we play here at ABLE.
Thank you all. And we can see from the experiences that you all are bringing to the table, we can have a really comprehensive conversation about what's needed. And I'm also interested in some of the connections we see with each other's work as this emerges. And so I want to just throw out a general question to get us started. And we talked a little bit about this before we started the panel. But I just wanted to lay out for you, it could be based on your work, based on something that's emerged recently for you. But what do you see as sort of the key issues that we need to be addressing for young people around supports, around educations and opportunities? And so I'm going to start with Sharon, and we'll just go around.
Sure, thank you. So, one of the things that happened with this pandemic is that we unearthed a lot of gaps in services that young people have that were never really considered to be critical. But in this environment, now we realize that they're super critical. And some of this might seem very obvious, right? And so first and foremost, I think what we learned is that technology is a big barrier. And so many people know the term the digital divide. I had done some work years and years ago out in Oakland, basically helping to get computers to low-income families with an organization out there. And so this is 5-6 years ago. And one of the challenges with this is that technology continues to evolve. And so we realize now that every young person needs to have a working computer, not just a mobile phone, because mobile phones are great, but you can't really write, you can't really effectively write papers on a mobile phone. You need to have broadband internet access in the home. And so, whether that is, land-based, at the very least, hotspot, and hotspots are not great, but they can be sufficient in some ways. The other things that have come out during this time, certainly we realized that the social emotional needs of our young people is really great. I think we all know, we're all of an age that we realize that the challenges that people of color are facing in this country have not gone away. I saw someone have a post today that 30 years ago today he remembered Rodney King being beaten. And so, here we are still dealing with the same challenges, which predate, even those times. And so all of our kids are certainly inundated with that. And I think the final thing is that, we have to continue to figure out how we have our young people become civically engaged. We had a lot of advancement under the Obama administration with people wanting to get really involved, and a lot of young people being disheartened under the Trump administration. And so hopefully we're seeing a change in that. But those three things, the technology, social, emotional, and civic engagement are really critical for our young people.
I think those are really clearly issues that resonate with me. Other thoughts for folks who want to add to that?
It's when you talk about civic engagement, last Thursday I just did a mayoral forum for youth ages 14 to 25. And I remember when I came up with this concept initially, my associate producer, I had almost an hour-long argument with her because she wanted to cover another topic, and she did not feel like young people would be engaged in this issue. And I was blown away by the engagement. We partnered with community-based organizations to get the youth, and all the way from criminal justice adjacent youth who are 18 to 25 to kids who were on the younger end of the spectrum and kind of had a different experience at home. And they were all really, really enthusiastic and excited to ask these mayoral candidates questions about their policy platform. So that just really resonated with me, and I just wanted to just throw that in there. And I agree with everything that you said.
And I appreciate you adding that the engagement. We sometimes we underestimate what people both want and are able to accept. I know I work with community organizations, and we work at a university, and we talk about data and research, and people are like, you can't talk that stuff about with people. And what you find is people not only want that, they're looking for opportunities to have people engage them around those things. And so we have to sometimes, take the noise out of people saying our folks don't want certain things and can't do certain things. When you find that you build it, they will come to wherever it is. Jerry, I thought you turned off your mic. You might have wanted to say something.
Yeah, that was that Zoom mistake again. I think what we found out is that white teachers are not engaged with Black students, and many of them can't teach. And whereas before, we would send our kids into these environments blindly, and then we just trusted the school system. And now parents had a chance to really listen how their students were being talked at and not taught. We also learned that the school had the buildings as an asset, and schools are not really part of the community. They're just a building in the community. And so what happens is we see now that districts want the same money, no responsibility, but the same authority. They want to govern kids at home in their own household without taking responsibility to teach them. They're saying things like, oh, we're a facilitator and the parent is a teacher now. So you can't have it all one way. And also, we are seeing this where now a failing school in California is going to lose money because of online, a student can attend a successful school in New York. So this is the best time in education because it's tearing down the outdated, corrupt system that we have. And I call the public school system one of the largest criminal organizations we have going on today. What other business can continue to get money but not deliver a good product? And with that, I hold parents accountable also. But the school system is the system that's there every year. You have new parents coming in and going out of the system, but the school system is consistent. How do you have the same bad teachers there who have not evolved? We're going to see an influx, let me say an exodus of white teachers, and it's an excellent opportunity for people of color to get an education because we're able to hold them accountable now. And let me give you a quick thing about how schools work. 77 to 83% of teachers are white women. So when we see people striking, we see a whole bunch of color, and we're thinking we need to support our teachers. So now we support the teachers to get a raise. Then the union gets the union dues, take the money, give it to lobbyists, to lobby to legislators to take away parents' rights to continue to send your school kids to failing schools.
I think that was just drop the mic moment there on that one. And I think that one of the dynamics we really do need to talk about is, and I think you've named it, and I'm going to go to you, Howard, is the structures that exist within the school system that help to perpetuate exactly the kind of system we have. I work with parents, and you cannot foster a relationship with a parent or community with a parent-teacher conference structure. Right? It is a structure that's not set up to actually engage anybody. Actually, it is to engage them, but to engage them in what we don't really know, right? What you can do in that structure. And so, to your point, Jerry, if we're going to make any change in the system, it has to be at the systemic and structural level, right? It can't be around the edges. You can't just be training, because what you find is cultures of schools eat up policy and training for breakfast. Right? If there's a culture of school, so how do you actually change a culture of a school, which would require transformation, not reform, in a lot of ways. And so, but Howard, I know that you started off your talk about one of the structures that actually engages, the whole life of a student, the kind of courses that they're able to take and the way that it's set up for them to be able to engage. Say a little bit about that and other issues that you think are
Sure.
important.
Let me quickly double down on what everybody else said too, Rich, because I absolutely agree with what I've heard. I love the comment about social emotional learning and the student. This idea that we really need to pay attention to the whole student. And there is so many things that I think are happening as a result of this moment in history that we just shouldn't let this time go to waste. Some people have said, let's not let a good pandemic go to waste, but let's not let a good crisis go to waste. And so I am hearing, and I'm encouraged by the fact that I'm hearing lots of district leaders saying, we're not going back to school, because that sounds like we're going back to the way we used to operate. And there are things that I'm seeing people tear down. Like there's conversations, I think you may have seen it in certain districts, where some certain students have taken the police out of their schools, for example, because from a social emotional learning standpoint, students weren't actually feeling safer with the police in their building, which is completely, opposite of probably what people perceived it as being. But the students themselves, based on relationships they have with police in their community, weren't feeling socially, emotionally safe in order to be able to learn in that environment. So we're hearing people do that. I've heard other district leaders talk about how, from the standpoint of when they offer education or where they offer it has to change, because we have students who frankly might have younger siblings who just can't get to school at the time they need to, just because of the obligations they have at home. Some are actually working to support their families. And so whoever said that the customer who pays for their education has to get it when the supplier decides it's convenient for the supplier. And so there's a great opportunity here, I think, to redo that. As you think about structure, I always tell people to think about it from this way, Rich. When we go to college, you have a major. And so when you show up, unless you're undecided, which usually doesn't last that long, there's a whole structure set up for what courses you're going to take, what supports are set up there for they know when you're going to have trouble. When you get out of that institution, typically that credential means you know exactly what types of jobs you can land, and companies have a recognition of your school, your credentials. So there's sort of this understanding of who you are at that moment, and they're ready to provide you, hopefully, with an opportunity to make money. There's a lot of kids who aren't looking to go post-secondarily to college. Some of them are looking to come right out and work. Some of them are looking to go in the military. And what we've got to do in our structure is provide the choice for the student to be able to make. If it's college, great. If it's military, great. If it's going to a career, great. But it has to be a viable choice and a meaningful one based on the education that was provided to them while they were in school. And these structures that we've learned to encounter and enable clearly show that there are decisions being made, unfortunately, that deny students the ability to have that choice. If you haven't seen algebra by 9th grade and you thinking you're going to college, and we've been in schools where we've surveyed the students and 75% of them say they want to go to college, and we'll survey and see that 40% of them have actually taken algebra by 9th grade, which means there's a disconnect, because more than likely the pathway you have from that point will not provide you with the type of math, the rigor of math you need in order to be able to take advantage of college. And these structures go on and on. There are prerequisites that were put in place. Some of them were clearly racist prerequisites. Some of them that would say you had to have a written recommendation from your previous instructor to get into the next class, and how that, when we started looking at it, negatively impacted students of color because they just weren't getting those recommendations from white teachers in particular. And so they were then stuck in a structure that didn't allow them to be successful, to attain that next level of education, even though we knew clearly they would be successful, and the data didn't show that the recommendation was needed. And so these types of structural imperatives were things that we had to continue to drive people to look at. And I can go on and on the list, but whether it's tutoring and supports, you can't provide people with a pathway that says you've got to take 5 classes when you only have 4 years of education left. You've got to figure out how to double down or do what we call, co-requisite education in the classroom to ensure to be successful. if reading's important, you can't structurally put them into social studies, science classes where the reading is high at a higher level than they're capable of doing, and not pausing to make sure that they actually have the reading capabilities before you move forward with the subject matter to which they're expected to absorb. I mean, it's an interesting sort of just opportunity, I think, and people have started to figure this out, that we just got to make sure we put structures in place that ensure that the customer that Jerry's talking about is getting the product to which they purchased. And I think there's just a disconnect because you pay tuition in school, in college, but you pay taxes when you're in your community, that people don't understand that that is actually paying for your education, making you a customer in that system. So those are the types of things that, you know, we're trying to work on.
Well, let's look at the structure here, because I think there's a question about, like you said, the structure that exists. Some of it is, like you said, is set up in such a way that schools are a very traditional structure. We're still going on an agrarian culture calendar. That's why we start in September and end in May, right? You know, and many of us growing tomatoes and cucumbers in our backyards for our subsistence, but we still have a structure that's based on that. And so some of these structures are about traditions. And my mother always used to say that schools are often set up for adult convenience rather than student support, right? So how do we change the structures to be? And as a structure, schools haven't changed much in 100 years. They still look a lot in very much the same way. You can't say that about a lot of other industries. And then there are some structures that are intentionally set up that way, right? To create those barriers, even though they might not name race, they do so in a way that builds that structure. An example would be, we're working with a group in Brooklyn, a group of parents in Brooklyn and the union. And we were finding that students were particularly students of color in that area, were not performing well on the lab section of the Regents exam. And what we found out is most of the schools in that district didn't have labs. So students were being tested on material and on experiences that they did not have in school, right? And that went on for years, right? Until there were a group of folks who advocated for this and lifted it up. Now, when you lift the light on something like that, you can say, well, the system didn't know, but there's also a part of this where the system does know. And that was a long, circuitous way for me to sort of bring into this moment where we're really in sort of a Black Lives Matter moment, where these are not only issues that are structural, but people are saying that they've been created intentionally. And so I'm trying to think through what are some of those things that have emerged in your work that say this is, in this moment, because there's a Black Lives Matter being focused on it. For example, for us, police and schools is now very different conversation now than it was a year ago. But I'm wondering if there are other issues that you're seeing in this particular moment of inequity that we've been able to sort of attack. I see Ro, and then I'm going to go to Jerry.
You know, just to answer your question right now, I think the biggest issue that I'm seeing right now in the wake of this moment, and there's a host of issues that preceded it that I would still like to talk about, but it's the social and emotional wellness component, especially with teens. It's really heavy. You know, there's a lot going on, and you know, I think that, you know, when we talk about tracking, you know, I guess that was the old term for kind of these education modules, curriculum modules that land you, you know, on a college preparatory track, or kind of you're graduating and you don't know what's your next stop. Those decisions are really made like in 4th and 5th grade. Like if we're being honest about it, they're made long before you ever realize it's a problem. And one of the things that was on my list about key issues was culturally competent teachers, which Jerry spoke to earlier, on culturally competent administrators and teachers. And I think that there's two, when it comes to Black students, especially at the elementary school level, there's two things that mean good, or there's two forms of behavior. It's like either you're bothering me and you are a problem, and then if you don't cause me trouble, then you're ignored, and we don't really educate you, but you're good, and we'll keep telling you you're good until you have to take a standardized test. And then we tell you that you're not so good. And if you cause me a problem, then you're a behavioral problem, and I'll put you in that bucket and put you on that track. And you know, my family kind of, I came to that realization in second grade before you have to take the third grade. And here in New York City, you have to take standardized tests. You begin taking them in third grade. And I recognized that, like, it was like you kept hearing how great your child was. And I wasn't the only parent that kind of, this is the aggregate of the parents that I was talking to of color, or Black parents. I wouldn't even say of color, but Black parents. The kid is so good, they should make more of them. They're the best thing in the world, or they're a behavioral problem. And those are the two, you know, kind of only two ways that the kid is viewed in that process, or by these culturally incompetent teachers.
Right. That binary choice of this or that. And I think part of what I'm seeing in this particular moment is we have to expand it to be a range of options and ways of being able to have justice.
Yeah, I think when you have, and it was, I believe to Jerry's point earlier, it's like when you have culturally competent teachers, and maybe this is that opportunity when you have teachers who aren't cycling out, there's an understanding of the spectrum of, you know, of behavior and interaction. And it's, our children aren't villainized, and they aren't seen as older than they are, and they're seen as children, you know.
Right.
And they're seen for their potential. Like that's the other thing. Kind of, there's the either lowered expectations or pity, you know, which is kind of the other side of the coin. Either they're villainized or they're pitied.
Right. Jerry, you were sort of,
yes. So basically what Ro is saying is abstract versus concrete. You're not going to tell a white parent that your kid, we should make more of them. They're going to say, little Jerry is doing ABC work, or he's a 5-star or something like that. But our students, like you said, are, he's so nice. Well, what about his grades? Can she write? Can they read? You know, so let me go back to something else, and I'll say this off the top. I've seen everyone from a kindergarten aide to a superintendent lie. They have one job, and that's to protect the district. Even if little Jerry is the best student in class, and now my parent go to the school and create a problem, now they're gonna say, little Jerry was okay, but this day, you know, he stepped out of line. They're gonna come up with something now to assassinate my character, because they had to invalidate or devalue what the parent is saying. And something else in the work and what we're talking about is the whole student. So when we go in and we advocate, right away we tell the school, we need to talk to your director of pupil services, because you need to pay for therapy for a Black therapist, male or female, for the student who you damaged. Because that's what it's about, is making sure the student is whole. Because these districts, we send our kids in there, and really they're the killing field. Mm-hmm. You know, that our kids are so bright at 2 and 3, and by 11 years old, we're praying that they can just graduate high school. Something else I want to talk about is our kids being adultified. That's what Rose said also. Again, if 2 kids fight, then that's an ed code, and I can quote it, 48900 A1, mutual combat. Both kids get 2 to 5 days. This is the lane we work in. But when the police are on site, they call the officer in when the administrators don't want to do their job. Now it's not an ed code, it's a penal code. Now both of these kids get charges for assault against each other. And that's how it starts. And was, again, you got kids just doing what kids do, fighting. It's part of growing up to figure out where you are in the ladder. But we see that many times administrators are so weak that they don't do their job, that everything is the daddy syndrome. They call in law enforcement, call an SRO, and now they're doing the administrator's job. And I know many SROs on different sites, And they say, Jerry, they're calling me in for everything. That's not what I'm here for.
Right.
But it's a contract with the district many times. So now they can't go at the administrator because now the administrator going to talk to a superintendent, and it could be a funny situation for when it's time to renegotiate the contract.
So Jerry, let me ask you this, and I want to bring the other voices into it. I mean, we're naming issues, but embedded in this, and I think it's something that we've talked about, you also are saying things that we can do in response to them, right? And so
Correct.
in response to the idea that you have teachers who aren't culturally competent, the strategy would be to identify ways of getting culturally competent. And I would say you'd even need people of color who are culturally competent,
Correct.
not only your skin folk aren't always your kin folk kind of thing.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
you sometimes need to have the cultural competence across the board. I think like you said, even in naming this engagement with administrators, having somebody who can go with you to be able to engage in that, you're often at a disadvantage. I think we're naming responses that we think need to be in place at a particular moment.
I put out PSAs. So one of my PSAs is, parents, you need to read the student handbook. You need to look at the district website. So when you get a call from the school, you can ask, where is it at in the student handbook? Where is it at on the district website? And where is it at in ed code? Can you show me? It's their job to show you where it's at, not your job to prove your kid innocent. Also, when you go to school, never go to a school by yourself,
right,
because the staff and administrators will lie on you. So even if you got to go in a meeting and call and put someone on speaker so they can hear what's going on, you need another witness to be on your side, because you're not going to go into a meeting with school staff many times by yourself. It's going to be anywhere from 2 to 7 of them in the meeting.
Right. I used to have a practice where and I do this now, is if you have a conversation with somebody, I don't know how many times someone would come back and say, well, so-and-so said to me X, Y, and Z, but it was said verbally. So the practice I would encourage parents to do, and we would do it together, is after a meeting, they would write a letter that documented what the conversation was. Out of this conversation, X, Y, and Z, and mail it to them and say, if you have anything you want to add to this, please send an email in response to it, or this becomes a record of it. And rarely people responded to it, but it became something that people could then reference back to say, these were my contemporaneous notes that I wrote at the time, that now becomes sort of a solid indication of what was actually said during that time. Because I think they were sort of rely on people to forget the conversation that they say. But I want to get Sharon and Howard's, Ro, did you want to jump back in here?
I was really quickly, I was also going to say something about the curriculum and just how non-engaging it is for most kids, especially by the time they get to their teen years. And just in general, I would just say my biggest thing is, like, don't leave it to the school, because they're not gonna do it. And, I hear a lot of people say, oh, tutoring is so expensive. But if you were paying for private school, it'd be much more expensive. And just don't leave it in the school's hands. And if you don't see something culturally competent or relevant in the curriculum, teach it to your kids yourself, because the school is not going to do it.
I'm going to drop in the chat. We've been doing a lot of work at Metro Center around culturally responsive and sustaining education. We actually helped to write the definition at the city and the state level and sort of talk it through. And we developed a scorecard that actually parents and schools have used to score whether your curriculum is either culturally competent and sustaining or culturally destructive. And actually, we had a principal that did it with his elementary school kids. It was one of the most engaging conversations about it. But like you said, we have to have tools that root that out, and then have people who are able to sort of develop those curriculum in some way. And I'm going to want to get Howard and Sharon into this. And we've sort of gone down this road of things that are emerging. I want to name one thing before we do that, is new leadership in our community. We did have 2 other women who were supposed to be on this panel in this moment. There's a whole lot of testosterone going on in our flow here, and I want to acknowledge Rose here. But in this moment, there's an emergence of particularly women of color, Black women leadership and new leadership. And I'm kind of curious, it doesn't mean that you can't respond to the other things, but I'm kind of curious about what you see about this moment creating new leadership opportunities for folks, even in our own community, who sometimes haven't had a chance to participate.
Sure, I'll jump in. So obviously, I mean, if you're watching the news, and particularly if you're in New York, there was an announcement of a new chancellor who is a Black woman. And so it's first ever. And so that's huge, very progressive. Coming from the space of working in a school, the thing that I think is very prevalent, and if you're a parent, you know this as well, is that there is a need for there to be more Black educators on the front line. Certainly there's a shortage of Black men in the classroom. And so, those things are, when we talk about social emotional learning, cultural competencies, yes, just because you're Black, that doesn't mean that you're attuned to all of that, but it is helpful and it's a step in the right direction. And so I think, the education industry in America in general has been hearing that message and is trying to figure it out. There have been some, advancements, but there's a lot of work to be done. The other thing, and again, this has really come up as a result of the pandemic, is a focus on making sure that there's just better training. For the first time really in my career over the last year and a half, I really heard a lot of teachers, particularly white leadership, talking about, all right, how do we take a step back and figure out how we do this work, and move away from having some of the biases that we have. And so, what are the organizations that we want to bring in to do the training? Where do we put the money in to do that, which is a step forward. But certainly there's a lot of work to be done. The whole infrastructure of how education is structured in this country, has a lot of work to be done. So I just wanted to add that part about Black teachers.
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, the interesting thing about this pandemic is it has actually, I wouldn't use the word forced, but it certainly has increased by a significant number, the number of superintendents who are stepping down, either because of just flat out fatigue over what they've been going through, or realizing under the pressure of all the things having to do with trying to service their community and respond to the social movement of today, that they need to step aside and let people with a different perspective come on board. I think the same thing is important for the boards themselves in terms of new board members. We've seen, a few board members, in Denver, whether or not you agree or don't agree, but there was an entirely new board that came into Denver Public Schools, thereby accusing that superintendent of not being capable of handling things as it comes to equity, and she ended up resigning. And so I think this is just the time, this is the time for new people to come in to broaden the perspective on what is required out of our schools. The stories that Jerry's telling just shouldn't be. And so we need more people to come in to insist on a different paradigm. As far as the woman thing goes, more women is always a good thing. We have a weird thing in education. If you really start to take stock of the number of teachers who are women, you would think there'd be more women in leadership positions just as a result of how many women are teaching. But for whatever reason, it seems to have not happened. But I think we're starting to see more of that. And it's an interesting question. It might sound like a bias, but there are some biases around women being much better at collaboration than men are. And this is a time when you're going to have to collaborate. You're going to have to work with your community. You're going to have to work with community organizations. You're going to have to work with people in their homes. It's just a different time. So if you're going to come in with a style of dictating and not wanting to be a listener, it's probably not a role you want to be in. So I welcome more women into that leadership role.
Pearl, I saw you wanted to respond.
Yeah, in response to kind of, getting more culturally competent and Black teachers and administrators in schools. What I've seen a lot in my television coverage, educational television coverage, is a lot of times when you have those dedicated administrators and teachers working within the system that is, kind of designed, to be adversarial, they burn out because they're just giving and giving and giving so much of themselves that it becomes, kind of caustic to them. So, I know we're supposed to be the problem solvers and offering the solutions, but I'm posing the question and maybe we can talk about it. How do we propose solutions that allow them to thrive once they're in those posts? Because the infrastructure is still there.
Yeah, I've been seeing, there you want to go, but I've been seeing
Go ahead.
a lot of people really concerned about that. I mean, it's a great question. When you get people coming in those leadership roles, there's the interesting sort of question of who is actually in charge of that person's development. How are we going to chart out and help understand what success means for that person in that role? Is that board equipped from a governance perspective to be of assistance to that person in a leadership role? I've seen more and more programs to how to try to help board members, certainly with this process, because I think that is critically important to making sure these new leaders are successful. But when you ask the question, it's a great question, because it's what causes, I think, so much churning in leadership, right? You get there, you're interviewed, everything sounds great, but no one's really helped to chart out what success means for you in that role. You're in it for about a month or two, fires happen as they're supposed to happen, and you get off firefighting and you forget about the overall mission and all the plans that you had to do and accomplish in that district. And then it gets confusing. People start saying, you're not doing your job. But the fact of the matter is that we probably didn't have a great discussion on what doing your job meant in the first place. And so I think that's a part of what has to happen in terms of making the solution work.
I agree. And I also, to answer my own question, I believe that wraparound services, and bridging the school and home and the community is critical. And it's a concept that is slowly, slow to take on, but it's essential as far as I'm concerned.
Jerry, you wanted to add something to this?
Yes, it has to come from the superintendent. And it has to be in everything that they put out, because you'll get a person in that's been in a position of equity, to roll out a program, but you don't have other staff to buy into it. So now you're fighting at every site and at every meeting getting pushback, and the superintendent need to come in and let you know what it is. And then from that, he needs the board to be on board with it also. And I'm saying this from a perspective, we have 2 lawsuits against Riverside USD in Riverside, California, both of them for racism discrimination. A young sister was referred to by a white track coach as cotton picking Kayla. So in May, the district put out a letter saying we support Black folks. So I go to the board president saying, how you saying you support Black folks, but you're defending your position on racism in our lawsuits? You're not congruent in what you're saying. So you're just trying to, again, and what we see is that was just a knee-jerk reaction. A lot of districts put out letters that we're for Black folks, we love Black folks, but we still see the racism discrimination going on. And I say the word equity is a new crack, because our system, the system is still going to use the politics, economics, legislation to still hurt our Black community when they continue to get this money. And all they need to do is change 7 words on a proposal or grant, and they can redirect the money. And we still will never see it for the failing Black students. And they'll continue to get the money every year. So again, it's a good hustle that they're working right now with the word equity. I'm in parent groups, and the pushback and the fight they have to go through to just get included in meetings and things like that. So it's still a lot of work to be done. It is some movement in some districts, but overall the system is a system, and it's going to protect itself.
And I'm good with this, Jerry. I also work with a lot of community groups that have made significant change. And so I want to balance the need for the system to change. And you're right, you're absolutely right that we're struggling. We've been struggling as Black folks since as far as any of us can remember. And then as far as the people that our people remember. And at the same time, I'm seeing some amazing, like you said, work that's being done by organizations like yours in being able to shift the narrative around me. And that's one thing I want to add here instead of an element.
Let me say this also. So I came from the business community,
Right.
and I'm not an educator by trade. But until our Black organizations and individuals who truly want to advocate have an independent revenue stream and how they can take care of their household and their legacy and generational wealth, then we're going to continue to have a problem.
Mhm.
Because that's the issue, is you have people going into education with good intentions, and they get there and they get caught up in the system. And now they have student loans, mortgages, cars. So when they speak out and truly advocate for a student, now they're considered a liability and not a team player. And many of them will lose their career because now everyone there at the site, because the superintendent is saying, oh, Jerry's a problem. Now he's or she created an atmosphere in which is not conducive for that person who truly want to help the students to succeed.
I'm with you on this, Sherry. And let me just say this on the narrative question, because I actually want to have you speak to this. There is a narrative in our community that is about, that is sort of an external narrative that I think speaks to some of the limitations of what we can and can't do, right? We talked a little bit about it before, right? And I think there's a narrative clearly around the challenges that we face, right? And I think you've named them as well. The narrative that I want to put in, I'm sort of stepping out of the moderator. The narrative I want to put is, and one of the, I'm on this call, I'm naming it now, of Black guys I went to college with. We've met every Friday at 6 o'clock since April of last year. And we have these conversations. And we have these same kind of conversations of what we need to do, what's happening. And one of the brothers said, that's true. But isn't it amazing what we've been able to accomplish as Black people with all of those things
Right.
in front of us, right? And so this is not a but to your narrative, it's an and, right? Because everything that you've said is absolutely right. And there's a narrative that we could describe that says, and in spite of all of that, we have risen to heights that no one would have imagined. And not where we need to go. It's not as far as and I think there's some importance in telling that to ourselves sometimes, because that is sort of what allows us to get up the next day and be able to fight again. And it doesn't even have to be a big win, but it's just, sometimes it's not even a matter of ending racism. It's a matter of ensuring that racism doesn't end you and your vision and your hope, right? That's an accomplishment in and of itself. And so when I was putting that out, it was not as a counter to it. It was an additional narrative that I think we can add to it. And I think the lessons of what we've been able to accomplish is a part of it. Ro, I think you wanted to add something.
No, I was gonna say I was more so referring to kind of under-resourced schools.
Yes.
And the geographic allocation of resources, and the fact that, for the most part, if somebody wants their kid to get a good education and they live in a certain neighborhood, their kid has to travel an hour or an hour and a half to get to an entirely different neighborhood to get that education, and feel the effects even more so of a lack of cultural competence and isolation, social isolation, which is just as damaging as being in a non-functioning school, to be the only Black kid in a functioning school. The damage is still done on both sides. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, the under-resourced school, where you have schools Absolutely. Where you have dedicated teachers and administrators who are culturally competent, but they aren't getting the support from the system to be successful.
Absolutely.
And how do we change that? And it just feels like so much bigger. And I like the idea of community-based supplementation. Unfortunately, I don't see a solution to kind of how to optimize our tax dollars that we're putting into the educational system at the same time.
The resources is a big question, that the amount of will that there is to invest in a system, particularly if that system's kids of color, they're viewed as other people's kids. And so the willingness And you don't see, it gets back to the narrative that you talked about, but where it's either these kids are deficient or they're deviant, right? And you're not investing in that. But if you saw potential, then you see the money you're giving as an investment in that potential. And I think that's what's lacking. How are you glad you? Sounds like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, it's a tough topic, right? Because I think we all know what we exist in and around.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it is what we can do in spite of the things that are here. And as I always say, we're not going to get bias out of people's hearts. I mean, that's just, anybody who's trying to do that is wasting time. And we're not going to therefore have people who stop underestimating our kids. That's not going to stop. But I think we have to work really hard at trying to make sure that we get families and the kids who frankly, you know, need to know more and have more information at hand when they're in school, to start a groundswell of effort. Like we're in this place of this pandemic, and again, not trying to go back to school, but go back to something new. How do we figure out how to get more information in the hands of families so they can walk just to right to their local district, you know, county people, just like we do when we want to vote for a president. Like there needs to be a different sort of voice around how we're going to impact that money that is coming, you know, out of our own pockets in our communities and being used in ways that's not in furtherance of our families. And that I think is just something that we're just going to have to get as emotional about as we did about George Floyd. You know, I've always had this thing in my brain that always says, you know, there is still a significant amount of economic movement and wealth that just doesn't also happen in our communities. But it's not just about education. It's about wealth redistribution. And so how are we going to get that movement going and be as angry and motivated about that as we did about George Floyd? And that's, I think, you know, it's an interesting sort of question of, you know, I don't feel that same sort of anger about the fact that, you know, I can go to a school district when I used to work in Detroit and they had a 10% graduation rate. Where's the outrage about that? That's just, there's no difference to me in the neck of those kids than there is in the neck of the man on George Floyd. What's the difference? We're still seeing systemic racism in our schools that are negatively impacting our kids and guaranteeing their path to prison. And so where's that outrage? I mean, that's the part that I think we're going to have to work on.
I do think there are
we
people
saw that
that
in 1968 in the Brownsville teachers strike.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how we get back to that, but we've had it, you know, like, and we got it, ironically enough. And when you talked about unions, we had a Black teachers union here in New York City, and the major union protested it and made it just get dismantled, I guess. I don't know exactly how I should refer to that, but that was all part of the teacher strike. And then what happened after that is it was a systemic defunding of the schools. So
there is, there is outrage out there. I work with community organizations, and one of the problems that we have in our work is that a lot of our work happens in silence and anonymity. This is why I think the narrative, because there are people who've been working for, you know, Fight for 15 for years. There are people who've been working on a lot of these issues, but because, like you said, there isn't necessarily a flashpoint like a Floyd that lifts it up, right? There have been people who've been working on police, you know, issues around police brutality even before that, and when this, so there's a part of it that I think that you're speaking to, and it actually speaks to what I think is an investment in organizations like yours, Jerry. Is I've seen a massive defunding of community infrastructure. It used to be that there were community-based organizations that had resources, that had access to people. They could be faith-based organizations that played that advocacy role or role so that it wasn't just an individual to a school, but it was now an organization to a school being able to do that. And I've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, a defunding of those communities, a defunding of those organizations, and a lack of infrastructure there that used to be the infrastructure that communities could go to for advocacy and support. So I would argue for investment in organizations like yours that are in communities that people now know they can go to and trust, that are independent from the system, that can provide that kind of support.
I agree with you. There's the only thing I'll add is, I don't know if we need a bigger flashpoint than the data that says how many of our kids are failing today. Like, and not because of their own efforts, but because the system isn't supporting them. And so I don't know. Yeah, it's sort of an interesting question for me. Like, I agree, we need a flashpoint, but then how much more data do we need in terms of
What wasn't a data?
Okay. So understand though, what was going on during the George Floyd situation? No sports, no entertainment. People had were cooped up in the house. People who had jobs didn't have. There was so many other things going on, but you didn't have entertainment to whereas you could turn the TV and see something else. So that's the thing. The situations haven't changed. It's just people say that's not affecting me. How long have we been hearing gang violence and then, no one comes out until it happens to their son and say, we need to stop gang violence? What about the mother whose son was killed 20 years ago? So until it happens in our household, that's when it's really outrage. And again, what you're saying, Howard, the numbers haven't changed in 20 years, the gap, Black students, white students, and we put billions into the system. So what I think needs to happen, I think that organizations are going to have to start back with freedom schools out of passion to want to help our students and then build from there. We can't lead in trying to build another school just like their system. And something else, when people say they want to start schools, you got to look at the parallel of schools to Black chambers. Your first big expense is the building. So now white schools already have the building. White chambers already have infrastructure and getting leads and support from the city. So if we start with the resources we have already, meaning churches or using people garages and starting pods, because that's what we saw happen right here during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Is many white organizations started pods. Why? Out of passion, because they wanted better for the student. So we have to lead in with the passion, and once we start making a change, the money will come.
I will just say, it's as a response, part of this is also us communicating with each other about this. There's a group here in New York that started a liberation school in response to those pods. So they're saying there are people who can't create them, and so they work with organizations to be able to do them. And so part of our work is, and I think including folks here, is lifting up work that's out there that people aren't seeing as examples of what should be. I think you just named something. Sharon, I want to get your voice in here. Where you've been in the thinking mode. I want to make sure that you have a chance to contribute.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. I was just listening to the panel talk, and I always wonder about whether or not it is the chicken or the egg in some capacity. We've talked about the influence of money, and we think about economic mobility and the work that many people will do related to college access is not just to have kids go to school. It is for them to have this economic mobility long term, as well as to be, citizens of our country. And so, I do think that we have to give some thought to also that oftentimes the money that is funding these opportunities in these schools are coming from outside of our community. And so we by default are having these experiences influenced by people who aren't us. And so, I don't know if there's a simple answer to it. I mean, part of the history behind why HBCUs were created was to try to alleviate that. And, if you look at HBCUs, obviously, historically, they've been underfunded. I'm an HBCU alum too. And so, I don't know if there's an easy answer to it. And I just bring that up there that, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that, there is money that influences these things that comes from beyond our community.
Are you referring to like foundation money and the stipulations tied to grants?
Everything, including taxes, right? Like, who's paying most of the taxes and who are the politicians that are in charge of deciding how those tax dollars are used in the communities in which we live in.
Yeah. Even though, interestingly, you can go to certain jurisdictions where a lot of that tax base is based in urban areas, which is diffusing out into those suburbs.
Well, it's ironic that when we talk about the money, the influx of money, here in New York City is maybe about 10 years ago, they were really covering this. But there's this supplemental funding that comes from PTAs at certain schools. My son has gone to 3 of them. And you wouldn't believe the amount of money that these parents put into the PTA and supplement the education with all kind of extracurricular and supplemental academic support for the students at those schools. So it's like it's coming out of their own pockets. And, you know, there's this thing in the New York City public school system called the Chancellor's Regs, and you would think that this would not be, I guess it's like the legal document, the binding legal document, the bylaws, I suppose, system. But you would think that this would not be okay, and to create such a disparate, you know, playing field, but it's happening a lot.
Yeah. Let me talk, and I think it speaks to something that and I'm looking at you, Ro, in particular, because you talked about narrative, and I think to the point that Howard and Jerry and you as well, Sharon, spoke to. What are the things that help to shape people's vision, narrative, and willingness to engage? We often think movements are started by things being bad. They aren't. They're started by people expecting things to be better. And so the way that we talk about particular issues, and it tends to be we write about them, right? Even in reports, when we do research, we'll write a report. I'm feeling, and I'm going to put this out here, that part of our challenge is we got to create a new narrative around what's happening with folks. And it's going to have to not only be the written word, it's going to have to be film, podcasts out there in the popular culture in ways that have our story shaping what it is. And what I found in education is you can talk about a kid being suspended, but you tell a story about a particular kid, and what that story is, it makes it lands differently. And so I'm kind of interested in what are the narratives we need to be having out. One of those narratives is that Black people don't care about education, which I think is, I have not found Black people that don't care, but they may not like the education they have. They might be talking about it, but I haven't had too many that said they don't like the concept of education. So, you know, what are the things that we should be putting out there that are the new kinds of narratives that sort of shape or shift the way that we even think about education and the way people think about Black folks in education?
The narrative is kind of mapping out how to navigate the system. I feel like, at least especially here in New York City, most of what I find are parents are completely just overwhelmed. And if you're working and you have other children, or, you know, just trying to deal with life, navigating this system, and for those of you who aren't here, you have to apply to get into a middle school. You have to apply to get into a high school. It's similar to the college application process. It's actually more difficult and more intricate than the college application process, actually. So I think the explainer videos just or explainer content, just how to navigate this system, because it is overwhelming.
You can go on YouTube and find out how to put in a floor and how to do plumbing. There should be a whole range of things for you to be able to access that information. I love that idea. Are there other thoughts folks want to add?
Can I double down on that? Because I think that's exactly right. Yeah. I think that is the challenge, is that people don't have enough information on how to navigate educational systems. So they don't understand the pathways that they need in order to be successful. They don't, if they knew their child was about to take, classic example is a child about to take a second year world language, and that second year world language isn't a continuation of Spanish, but they decide to be creative and take French. And then they look up and they apply to college, and all of a sudden the college is like, you need 2 years of the same language. Like, there's just things that people do in their decision-making process that people need to be in front of them, telling them right or wrong. And we're going to rely on our counseling system, which is overburdened, overloaded 2,000 kids to a counselor, it's not going to happen. It's got to be putting more information in the hands of the people who have to own their own path, because unfortunately, we can't sit back and wait for the system to do it for them.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add one thing to this conversation around narrative and shaping the vision. For decades, we have had these narratives shaped really from a negative position. And so more progressive organizations these days really try to figure out how to do that from a positive position. And so, examples being, I don't want to name names of particular organizations, but they'll talk about a young person who happens to be of color, who comes from a poor community. And so, the work that my organization that I left and other organizations try to do is, how do we reshape that conversation so that kids feel better about themselves? And so that looks like, all right, here are stories of kids who are doing amazing work in technology, growing sector, and how we figure out to tell more narratives from that perspective that don't have to focus on all these negative aspects, really, I think is sort of the pathway forward for us.
Jared?
I am launching a internet TV station, the Black Student Advocate TV. And right now we're shooting and recording shows, real stories from the Black Student Advocate, and where we interview parents so they can give their perspective and their stories. Because part of it is parents can't believe what's going on in school systems. They're like, this can't be happening, because they think they're the only one. So if you go to school at 10 o'clock and another parent is leaving and you pass each other, you don't ask them, why were you here? But it's the same issues. And that's the advantage. The district know it's the same issue, but you as parents, they don't. So that's part of the work we do, and along with education, is helping parents navigate the system, because once you understand the system, then you're empowered. Part of the game is the schools don't want parents to come there and get, because as you come, many times you go to the district, you learn more and more and more. Now you're empowered, and the district loses their power. So parents really are in the driver's seat, and sending your kid to a school is no different than any other service contract. Plumber, electrician, mechanic, if they're not fixing a problem, then you can go get the problem fixed. But in the school system, because of legislation, you're forced to send your kid to failing schools.
I love the idea, and part of the work we do in organizing, the first training we do with parents is learning their rights, what they have a right to have access to, in addition, and where to go in the system. So this is what you go to the principal for, you go to the superintendent for this, because that information, like you said, is really critical in being able. Please go ahead.
Yeah, there's a big thing that I kind of want to mention before I forget it, because it keeps leaving my head. There's a stigma within the Black community about IEPs. And if you look on the other side of the road, they are accessing these IEPs. And what happens is after middle school, like after 5th grade, at least I could say here in New York City, after 5th grade, it becomes exponentially more difficult to get an IEP for your child so that they get the support they need from the system. But they don't want to pay because it costs more at the middle school and high school level. So you got to get it in elementary school. And a lot of times they will discourage you and divert you and keep you from getting it. And a lot of times that's the support that a student might need. And that is something that parents need to know kind of when they walk in the building, but a lot of times they're finding out in 7th or 8th grade by the time it's too late.
Well,
Let me speak to that.
I want to let you speak to it, Jeb, but we're close on time. So I want to give everybody an opportunity to sort of have an opportunity to close it. So definitely get a chance. I'll start with you to be able to say what you want to say in closing. And one of the things we do want people to walk away with, in addition to what we're saying, if there's either a tool or action that we could share with people, it's something that we think is the next step, so that folks can walk away there. But Jerry, why don't you give a chance to respond to what you heard and to
Okay. So I tell parents the IEP is a super cape, it's your Batman cape. If you can get one, because now that's going to be hands off many times for how the district deals with your baby, and that's federal law. So what that means is if your kid might have a little behavior, they can't get kicked out of school for that behavior. So that's your super cape if you use it properly. And how the school districts work is that if you have a California baseline is 20,000 for a kid, you start adding up different services, one-on-one, behavior, speech, that kid might be worth $35,000. Now you put 20 of them kids in a classroom, that classroom's worth 700,000. You put one teacher in there making 65 and one aide making 35. Now that's $600,000 to the positive for your for that classroom. So your kid is labeled with all these services. Your kid is an asset, but when it's time to deliver the services, your kid is a liability. And in passing, again, closing, I'll just say that we just got to continue to uplift our community, stand in the gap when parents need us to stand in the gap, give them a word of encouragement, and just tell them that they can do it because we've been doing it for so many years.
Terrific. I'm going to go to Howard. Give you a chance to.
It's been a really interesting discussion.
Absolutely.
It really has, and I love all the topics that we're talking about. I think it just speaks to just how complicated all this is. And it's unfortunate because, you know, we have so many families who are first generation, who have, you know, an inability to navigate the system, and the complicated nature of it is forcing them into a situation where there's not enough information for them. They can't navigate. They can't. And so my closing remarks are, one, I still encourage, because I do see new leaders coming in who recognize this problem and are trying to address it. I really believe that, you know, if we're going to have a 1 million man march on anything else in the future, or a 1 million woman march, or 2 million, all women, all men, we need to march on this issue. I think this is our time. You know, there aren't a whole lot of times when people are still sort of dealing with nothing because they're still out of work or they're still not able to travel. And, you know, what I worry about more than anything else is that when everything goes to some level of economic normalcy, that we'll forget. And, you know, I think Jerry called this sort of the crack of the day. I just worry it's the movement of the day and not something that we're going to sustain going forward. So my advice to anybody who's working in this area, who has children in this area, is you got to navigate the system. You got to demand more from the system. You got to recognize yourself as the customer. And, you know, I don't care if it blows up because people are asking more of it than it's capable of doing. That's what we need to do. We can't sit back and watch it continue to underserve our kids in our community.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Sharon?
Thanks. So I know that in many ways I'm talking to the choir, but you know, there's two things that I'd really press for. And so one is those of us who have been fortunate enough, you know, to have a great education, build great lives for ourselves, really need to leverage the opportunity to mentor young people. And so whether that's in a professional sense or informally, really the only, you know, one of the key ways we're going to get there in terms of helping young people advance and be successful is through mentorship. So I encourage people, you know, to proactively reach out to people from various younger ages and generations to do that work. The second thing is that, you know, it's a whole nother topic separate from education, but related in a lot of ways is, you know, we have to continue to teach our young people how to invest and build wealth and understand finance. I feel like that's just not taught nearly enough. Super, super critical work. And so I would encourage people, you know, if there are two things that they take away from this conversation that they can do that can be impactful in changing things, it's the mentoring piece and certainly the financial awareness piece as well.
Thank you so much. Pro?
So I feel like I have two things as well, similar to what Howard said as far as being an advocate and knowing how to get what you need out of the school system. And if you don't know how to get what you need, just follow the chain of command. Go to the district office. If your school isn't doing it, go to the district office. If your district office isn't doing it, find the superintendent and talk to those key people that you need to talk to until somebody's listening to you. The other thing is, the school may very well not help you. So I would say never leave it in the school's hands. Like it's your child or it's our community, and we cannot leave it in this institution's hands, because this system, this entire, system that we exist in was designed to subjugate us and created to, oppress us. So it's not necessarily going to function in our favor. So if there are resources that, if you have to go outside of the system to find resources, do that. Start with your religious institution, community-based organizations, NAACP, like just call like your church, whatever it is, just start with a phone call and they will find resources for you. Your local elected, here at city council, alderman, whatever it is, start there, but just try to find resources outside of the school as you're trying to work within the system, because as Jerry said, the school system is going to, try to save themselves, but you have to save your kid.
Right. I want to thank everybody for, this is a great panel. We didn't have much chance to plan, but you don't need to plan when you got folks. This is the Brilliant Minds, and so I want to appreciate you all for your brilliant minds in bringing that to this. I'm going to add a couple of resources. I talked about the culturally responsive scorecard that we used for scoring up our work. This is from NYU. I'm sharing in the chat. That becomes a useful tool in being able to identify culturally responsive and sustaining education. I'm also dropping in the chat a film called Parent Power, which is going to be the last part that I talk about, which is, I think, flows right off of both what everyone is saying, is that there are these ways of building collective power that have historically moved us, right? Our organizing efforts. We have not made movement in this country as Black people as just as individuals. It's required a collective effort. And so how we do that in a way that allows for us to build the power, to recognize as parents, we're not alone. This isn't happening to us because of our kids. Parents aren't leaving their good kids at home and sending the bad ones to school. These are the kids that we have, and schools need to be able to deal with them. And what you find is parents, when they realize and talk with other parents and come together, they realize it's not us, it's the system. And how do we build our power to be able to make those changes? And I think that power is not only talked about here, but will be a consistent theme in all of the Brilliant Mind conversations. But this one has ended. And so I want to thank our panelists for a great conversation. I don't think that I'm supposed to turn it over to anyone because we're at time. So I give the old adage that you don't have to get off of Zoom, but Zoom will be ending shortly. But we thank you all for coming to this great, and the next session will be next week. Am I saying that, is that correct? That's next week?
That's correct.
All right, that's correct. That's my brother Thierry Fortune is telling me that I'm correct, and so I must be. So there will be another session next week, and we hope that you all will come and attend in, and give us a thanks to our panelists, Howard, Sharon, Jerry, and Ro for a great conversation. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Blessings, everyone.